Hello, everyone. Welcome to class 3 of level design and game architecture. This class will be talking about meaning and player experience. From the syllabus for the week, your reading was Architectural Approach to Level Design, Chapter 3, Level Design Workflows, a pattern language, the Christopher Alexander book to pick one pattern, and then you had a recommended reading of Pattern Language for Game Design, Chapter 9, the section on the player experience pattern. You should have completed all of those things by the beginning of class, either on Monday or Thursday for you, depending on your section. The lecture topics for today are going to be a little bit on functional elements, a little bit of a second lecture on that, going into Ludic affordances, macro and microcirculation patterns, some mechanics and dynamics, and learning. We're going to talk a bit about meaning in games. We're going to talk about deconstructing levels, specifically the phenomenology of play and meaning, individual experience, and something cool called hermeneutic grids, which you totally use but don't know what they are yet, or maybe you do. And we're going to talk about player experience, tension, release, challenge, and so on. And then in class, we're going to identify some existing design elements relating to those player experiences. And then we're going to do a pattern exercise creating patterns around them. And then for our project, you're going to be creating a simple design of an encounter, and you're going to describe where that encounter falls within the game's overall design in terms of the game beats, location, and micro and macro encounters. That scene will, of course, be based on the player experience pattern that you create. Cool. So, ludic affordances. What is a ludic affordance? So, ludo is games and play of games specifically, and affordances are things that help you do something, help you be able to do something. So, a ludic affordance is something that helps you play a game. So, what do ludic affordances look like in terms of, say, circulation patterns in the game, how the player is supposed to move through a level or through the game in general? In order to talk about that, I have to give you another large word, or two large words. That is diegetic and non-diegetic. Diegetic means something that is intrinsic or part of, in our case, the game world. So a interface, say a directional interface in a game. If you have a compass that floats up at the top of the screen, say something like what you would see in Skyrim, that is non-diegetic, right? The player or the character in the game doesn't see a compass floating up in the air, at least not in Skyrim. If you had the ability to pull out a compass and have your character look down at their hand and see the compass, that would be diegetic, right? It's part of the game world, the character sees it, and you're seeing, through their perspective and understanding it. If you were doing a sci-fi kind of a game and your character had a heads-up display that was going on, then you're kind of, bending things and breaking the rules, and maybe you do see a compass floating up in the sky above your head. But in general, is it part of the game world? Does the character know about it? It's diegetic. So, circulation patterns. How do you tell players how they should move through a level? You could do that diegetically or non-diegetically. If you had a diegetic example would be there are signs in the game world, that say boss this way, or, you're in a hospital and you see medical help this way. If they're chasing a monster and there are environmental clues like, bloody footprints on the floor going off in a direction, that is a diegetic affordance telling them what their circulation pattern through the level should be. I should go find the monster. So that's what ludic affordances for navigation might look like that. Non-diegetic ones would be the kind of thing you see in Fable 2, where you can, hit a button on your controller and a sparkly line goes off in the direction that you should be going. Oh, cool, that's where I should go. A number of games sort of went that direction for a while. Eventually, that style has sort of gone out of favor, but you still see it sometimes. A mini-map would be a non-diegetic Ludic affordance for circulation patterns, right? It's going to show you where your quests are on the mini-map. If the character has the ability to actually see that, then it would be a diegetic affordance. So if you think of the movie Aliens, where there's like that sonar thing that shows you where the aliens are out, or where there's movement out in the distance mounted to the top of the Marines' guns, and you look down and you see where the alien is, that would be a diegetic affordance telling you how you might want to be moving. What would ludic affordances in terms of mechanics look like? That would be things that are going to tell you what to do in the game. You approach a pit and a prompt comes up that says, you know, press A to jump over the pit. That is a mechanical ludic affordance telling you how to behave. The same thing, you know, press E to open the door when you get close to a door. Ludic affordance telling you what mechanic to use at a given time. So that's pretty common. You see that in, you know, a diegetic, those would all be non-diegetic. Another non-diegetic one would be interactable objects glowing when you get close to them. You know, you might have a diegetic thing saying, a sign saying, you know, turn this wheel to lower the drawbridge. You know, that's in theory, that exists so that people who need to lower the drawbridge in the world would read that sign, see that in, you know, in character and lower the sign. Really, it's talking to the player, but it's doing it in a way that appears to be part of the game world. Dynamics is a little trickier. So that's how elements are interacting with each other, how you know, they're going to create an experience and then trying to convey that to the player. Ludic affordances for different monsters have different powers, and some are better against others, you know, and in some complicated system. How do you convey that to players without saying, you know, dragons are good at killing kobolds, kobolds are good at killing lizard folk, and lizard folk are good at killing dragons? You know, it's an arbitrary set of strengths and weaknesses. How do you convey that easily to users? Well, if you have like a system of elemental strengths and weaknesses, you're like, well, you know, fire is good against wood, but water is good against fire. And those are affordances because they play on pre-existing knowledge in this case. So you might have a non-diegetic explanation of that in a little chart that's using you know, something that is intrinsic to the game world to explain how the mechanic of some things are stronger against others, mechanic or dynamic that you would have between those systems. And then you see this kind of thing a lot as in learning, in tutorial levels. When you introduce a new system, then your web page refreshes. At least it came back to where it should be. So I don't know if you all saw that, but it wasn't my fault. You see that a lot in tutorial levels, and affordances are important when you're introducing a new piece of information. So often we're thinking about, how do I teach the player about this thing in the game? What affordances am I creating for all of the different gameplay aspects that I need to convey to the player? And this goes back to what we talked about, levels being communication. How are we going to communicate specific pieces of information? One of the ways is through affordances. So there you go. And we'll talk, a lot of the stuff we'll talk about later in terms of symbols and symbolism in games relates back to these kind of, creating these kind of affordances. Random reading, if you're interested in this kind of thing and you want to look at sort of an academic analysis of affordances, somebody wrote a paper about Quake 4 and talked about the affordances that exist within that game to teach you things. So there's a link to a pretty interesting, if somewhat academic paper talking about that. Moving on. All right, so meaning. I've said this a bit before, but everything in games has meaning. Everything. That's all of the bits of level design we put in, every mechanic we introduce into the game. Is my game a shooter, and the way that I interact with other characters in the game is by shooting them, or is it a dating sim? And the way that I interact with them is by talking to them. That choice has meaning, conveys a different narrative by choosing the core mechanic of the game being dialogue or being murder. I love me some murder games, don't get me wrong. Not all meaning in games is huge, right? If I choose to have a shotgun in a game, or to have a rocket launcher in a game, does that have a huge meaning difference, or a sniper rifle? No, but there is meaning in those different methods of interacting, even within shooting, right? Like the feel of a character using a shotgun is going to be different than the feel of a character using a sniper rifle. If you're trying to tell a story about a calm, calculating soldier, then you maybe want to choose to have a sniper rifle be the primary type of gun you're using in the game. If you're trying to tell a story about somebody who is bold and aggressive and rushes in, then maybe you want to give them a shotgun. And that might be in terms of the enemies, right? Not necessarily the character. What kind of story are you telling with this enemy? They're supposed to be a tough that's in your face. I'm going to give them a kind of weapon that conveys that. I'm going to give them AI behaviors that convey that. I'm going to dress them in a way that conveys that. A soldier looks different than a hitman, and I'm going to take that meaning. So all of the different kind of things you put into the game are going to convey something. And a lot of the times the individual things that you do aren't huge, but collectively that the meaning can be, it defines the game. Also, not all meaning is going to come through to all players. So if I'm from a Christian background, and I'm familiar with churches and the specifics of them, then seeing different things in the game, in a church that I go into, are going to convey a particular set of meaning to me. If I'm not from that culture, then a lot of that's going to be lost on me. Like I'm not going to understand what the meaning of something is. I sort of, there's the, I'm not going to understand the images in stained glass. Sure, right? Like I might not be familiar with that particular Bible story that's in the stained glass, or why there is a rose window, like what that's supposed to represent. But also, like, it may be something more practical than that. There's a game, The Secret World, and it's a horror MMO and puzzle based. There was a puzzle that relied on the user looking at a number that was on a sign hanging in front of the church next to where the pulpit was that the preacher would be speaking at. And you get a clue that says something about you need to use the words from the song that they're going to sing in this service to figure out a code to unlock something. And I was super, super confused by that, not realizing that it's very common in the denomination that was being represented that what hymn was going to be sung would be posted on a sign at the front of the church. And so it was very easy for the people who happened to be from that denomination to go, oh, that's the number of the song. Let me walk over to one of the pews, open the hymnal, turn to, which will automatically turn to that page because they didn't make it that hard. And that's going to give me the clue that I need to solve my puzzle. I didn't have that background. I didn't understand that part of the puzzle, and had to go and, look it up and find that out. So that's a literal puzzle solving meaning, but also the general thematic meaning is not going to be conveyed to everyone. Another really good example of that, the game Papoyo, which takes place in the slums in Rio and is about a kid and his alcoholic father. I found the game really powerful and moving, but I know that I missed so much detail in that setting, like so much meaning of different things that I would come across, different pieces of environmental narrative. I just didn't have that background. And so the game wasn't able to be as moving to me as maybe it was to somebody who has either the background of dealing with a alcoholic parent or dealing with living in that location. So when you're choosing settings and creating worlds, think about who the players are going to be and recognize that one, the players aren't going to be you, and two, players who aren't familiar with your setting aren't going to understand it as well. And so you need to create affordances for them narratively to tell them what's going on more than you might think you do. All right, yeah, and so another example of that is from Pop Tropica that I worked on. We created Steamworks Island, which was, you know, a cool idea. It's like, hey, we're going to create this steampunk world, and because we want to create that kind of art, we think it's hot right now, and it's going to be a mystery story about like where did all the people who populated the island go. And you know, I was in those early meetings, and I'm like, yeah, this sounds awesome. And then I was off doing some back end things, and I came back to playtest, and the level that actually got built was so all the people in the island have hidden in cryo chambers because the plants that they had been you know, biologically engineering turned evil and were trying to kill them, and so they all had to flee. And so in the game, you play a mech that has pesticide sprayers, and you have to tromp through the metallic island, killing all of the plants in order to be able to free the humans to live in their pristine mechanical world that is now plant-free. I'm like, so does this have an anti-environmental message on purpose? And they're like, well, what are you talking about? This isn't anti-environmental. And I'm like, I just spent the last hour killing all of the plants and now live on a plant-free mechanical island. And they're like, huh. We didn't think about that. So they didn't intend to create that meaning. They did. That was my experience of the game, but it wasn't something they did on purpose. So you may not be aware of what the meanings of things you're using in the game are. We'll talk a little bit more about ways that you can try to be more aware of those things and avoid that kind of problem. All right, deconstructing levels. So there's three pretty interesting bits here. First one being the phenomenology of play and meaning. So what is phenomenology? That's another big word. It's a school of thought that stresses the importance of the phenomenon. That's sort of not helpful, that kind of circular. It says that the experience of a thing is what's important. A lot of people take that really far and say the phenomenon is all that's important. That your experience of the phenomenon is what matters. And so you get this sort of experiential relativism where the only thing that matters is what you experience. And this is not saying that. Like, phenomenology is really trying to say that the thing that's being studied is the experience, and that experience itself can be studied, and that it's important. So you have this, you know, people love to take extreme positions. So you have people saying the experience is the only thing that's important. The author's intent or the actual artifact of a game or whatever doesn't matter. What actually matters is what the player experienced, and that's all that matters. And you have other people saying that, well, the experience doesn't matter at all. It only matters what's actually there. Like, this is what the game level is. If you took it the wrong way, that's on you. You're bringing that to the game. That's not actually in the game. You know, and you'll hear designers using that to defend something that they put into a game because somebody was offended by it. They're like, well, I didn't mean that. It doesn't matter what you think. Both of those points of view are pretty narrow-minded. You know, I think it's both important what you intend as a designer and what experience people take away from their play. You have to be aware of both parts of that. That pretty directly leads to intended and individual experience, which is you intend for your game to mean one thing, but it's going to have different meanings to different players depending on their background. Both sides of that are important. And part of using levels and mechanics to communicate in games is developing the skill of understanding who your audience is, what their experience is likely to be of the levels and mechanics that you're creating. How do you go about understanding that? So then we come to hermeneutic grids, which I think sound really, it's a fun phrase. Super not clear about what it means initially. I had to look this one up the first time I taught the class. What are you talking about? Hermeneutics turns out to be the science of understanding texts. It was something that initially related to sacred texts. So religious scholars would study texts, and being scholars and not just clergy, they recognized that when they studied the text, they understood it one particular way. But then they would read things that other scholars who were also devout read and interpreted it in a different way. Sometimes that starts religious wars. But in this case, these people were wanting to understand and being a little sciencey. And so they made spreadsheets. And they started saying, all right, so these people understood this, this scripture to mean this thing, and these people understood it to mean this thing, and these people back then understood it to mean this thing. And they started organizing that, right? And they laid it out onto sort of a Cartesian grid and said, people who are more like this understood it this way. People who are more like this understood it this way. And they ended up with a two-dimensional plot of the understanding of meaning of different texts. They created a grid, and so that was a hermeneutic grid. We're going to see a lot of these in the rest of the class. The one that you're most likely to be familiar with would be the Bartle player types, right? Killer, collector, explorer, and so on. That's a hermeneutic grid. And many different game design theories sort of map to that kind of a grid. If you look at the work of Nick Yee, his surveys and categorizations are creating hermeneutic grids looking at different aspects of gameplay. So those are pretty cool. All right, moving on to say that a different way. And I'll probably give this little bit of speech a couple times in the class. I think it's really important. What are we designing when we design a game? We're not designing the physical game, whether that be a board game or the code that creates Destiny or Doom or whatever. We're not creating that physical artifact. Isn't the game. That's not what we're interested in having done, right? I don't make a board game and say cool and stick it on a shelf, and that my purpose was to have made it and stick it on a shelf. It's not even the rules or the act of like participating in the rules. The objectively watching people play the game isn't the purpose of the game. But the experience of playing the game, what happened to you when you played it, what went on in your mind, what was your experience, that is what we're trying to create. But I can't control what my players experience, right? All I can control is the physical artifact I produce, whether that be a board game or a digital game or a sport. That's all I can control is the thing that I can make, and then I can provide suggestions or affordances to try to help the player use that tool that I've created for them in order to engage in a particular experience. So it's important then for us to understand all of those tools and how to create them very well, but also to understand what kind of experiences the player might have when they use those tools, when they play our games. So it's not the game itself, it's not the play of the game, it's the experience of the user playing the game that we're really interested in. And so it's hard to shape that, and we need to understand what those experiences might be. So player experience then. What are player experiences? Player experiences, as we're talking about them here, are not emotional responses. So to say this game was fun, or this game was sad, or this game, was exciting even. That's not what I'm talking about here. We'll get to those soon, and we'll look at how to actively create those. But what we're looking at this week is the sort of objective experiences that the players are going to have. When they have an emotional response, it's a response to something. What you're responding to when you're afraid in a game, may be the experience of tension that you're having. So these are less emotional and more experiential. Things like tension and release, challenge and reward, effort, uncertainty and risk, balance and oscillation, contrast, variation, rhythm. Some of those things may be used to create other things, right? The contrast between combat and rest may create an oscillation in the tension the player is experiencing. You may structure those things in such a way, vary them, so that you can create a sense of rhythm in the gameplay. So all of these different experiences work together, and are complex, have complex interactions with each other. So this is not remotely a exhaustive list of player experiences. These are just examples of the kind of things that are what I'm meaning when I say player experience. So that list, are those patterns? Is rhythm a pattern? Is tension a pattern? I mean, you could probably frame some of those things as patterns, but more often they're either the problems a pattern's trying to solve or part of the problem a pattern's trying to solve. They're often made up of many gameplay elements, right? You're doing a bunch of things with different gameplay elements to create a sense of tension, but the sense of tension isn't necessarily the purpose of the pattern. So yeah, to say it differently, the phenomenological result of the application of the patterns are the player experiences. So to use all of our big words for the week. All right, so after this, I'm going in class we will do a show and tell. We will talk about the readings and assignments, and then we'll have some practice where you're going to look at the formal and functional patterns that you have, exchanging them and reviewing them with your other groups. And then we're going to do exercise 5, which is from the reading, looking at tools and techniques. And then we're going to do exercise 6, which is going to be actually creating a player experience pattern. And then you will have your assignments for the week, which will be, again, picking a pattern, reading chapter 4 for next week, and writing up the pattern for exercise 6. And then, I'll talk about this more at length in class, but your project for the week will be to design the encounter described from the syllabus section at the beginning, using tools from the textbook, incorporating patterns that your group members found in exercise 6, and describing the elements and filling out your readings and assignments document. All right, so that concludes this lecture, and I will see you all in class.